I never asked for much. After retiring early from the forestry service, I came back to the only place that ever felt like home. My father's old cabin nestled in the folds of maple-covered hills, just east of Fairgrove. My name is Paul Whitaker. I'm a single father widowed too young, and though my daughter Emily is grown and living out in Oregon now, I still keep her old tire swing hanging from that gnarled sugar maple in front of the porch. Some mornings, when the wind stirs just right, it creaks softly, like the trees remembering. I lived quietly, mostly alone, except for my dog Rufus and the calls with Emily every Sunday. I tended to the land the way my father taught me, rotating sap taps, clearing underbrush, nurturing the wild places instead of taming them. We weren't just forest owners, we were stewards. The land had been in our family for 3 generations, and though some of the boundaries were rustic, marked by stacked stones and old timber posts, our deeds were clear, recorded, and legally unshakable. At least that's what I believed. When the first surveyor flag showed up, I thought little of it. Just some new development nearby, maybe a neighbor adding a fence. I plucked one out of the soft moss near the stream bed and tossed it aside. But a week later, more appeared, bright plastic ribbons, stapled to trunks deep within my maple stand, well past my eastern ridge, even along the northern creek where my sugar line ran. Then came the drone, a small buzzing thing that hovered low, pausing over the cabin, zipping off into the trees. I waved a rake at it, annoyed. The next morning, there were stakes hammered into the trail pink spray paint on rocks marking something. But no one had knocked. No notice in the mail. No calls. It was Rufus who first growled at the newcomers. A white SUV rolled up the gravel lane, unmarked but clean. Out stepped a woman in slacks and heels, entirely unfit for forest terrain, flanked by 2 men with clipboards. She introduced herself with a smile so sharp it could cut sapwood. Karen Roth, president of the HOA for the Fairgrove Hills Expansion District, she said, extending a hand like a queen bestowing grace. We're initiating phase 2 of our neighborhood naturalist eco-living project. You must be Mr. Whitaker. I live on my own land, I said, not taking her hand. There's no HOA here. Oh, she said with a practiced little laugh, but you're within the expansion corridor now. Haven't you seen the proposed zoning overlay? That's when the tension started low in my stomach, like sap boiling in a kettle. They didn't ask for permission. They told me what would happen. A few eco-cabins to promote environmental appreciation, attract tourism dollars, increase neighborhood value. And think of the educational potential, she chirped. Maple syrup workshops, for kids guided nature walks, you could even offer forest tours from your cabin. We'll feature your homestead on the community map. I stood there on my porch, fists at my side, watching her smile widen, like she was doing me a favor. Ma'am, I said, this land's not for sale, lease, or showcase. It's mine, and it's staying wild. Her smile faltered just a flicker, and she leaned in slightly. That may be what you believe, Mr. Whitaker, but you'll want to check with the county and your title company. Things have changed. Then she walked back to her SUV as if the matter was settled. I spent the next 3 days digging through my lockbox, deeds, plats, surveys, all in order. I drove down to the county clerk's office, heart pounding. My parcel hadn't changed, but I noticed something odd. An application for a conservation development overlay had been submitted under the HOA's name. It included my parcel, and the contact listed Karen Roth. The clerk, a weary man in bifocals named Darren, frowned when I pointed it out. That's not how this works, he muttered. They can submit whatever, but it doesn't mean it's valid. You own this land outright, right? 3 generations, paid off, fully deeded. You can see the 1946 boundary lines. He nodded. I'd lawyer up, just in case. I went home angry. Then the sounds started, first distant, then closer. Chainsaws, backhoes, diesel engines. Rufus barked wildly from the porch as a lowboy trailer rumbled up the old logging road carrying lumber and prefab walls. No knock, no courtesy, just building. I tried to block them at the fork that led into the forest trail. A foreman waved a sheet at me. Got permits, he said. Signed off by the HOA Development Board. Cabins No. 1 through No. 20 go in this quadrant. This is my land, I shouted. Talk to Karen. They left tire ruts a foot deep in my moss. That night, I sat by the fireplace with the old map of the land spread across my table, tracing the lines with shaking fingers. Rufus lay his head in my lap, sensing my unrest. I remembered when Emily had once gotten lost in those woods as a child, and I found her huddled under a maple with her backpack and flashlight, refusing to leave because she thought the tree was protecting her. Now that same grove was being staked for drainage and parking for eco-hikers. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not with rage, but with purpose. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't just a retiree with a dog and some trees. I had been a federal liaison once for environmental conservation task forces. I knew the language, I knew the laws, and I knew the people. If Karen wanted to drag me into a war over land, I'd show her what happens when you trespass on sacred ground. But first I needed proof, I needed patience, and I needed to stop being afraid. I didn't sleep much after that first confrontation. The sounds of engines grumbling and trees cracking in the dark didn't help. They'd brought in floodlights, station generators along the path that led to the eastern slope of my forest. That slope had always been the quietest part of the land, where the sugar maples grew tallest untouched for decades. Now it pulsed with artificial light through the night, the forest canopy aglow with a sickly amber glare that turned the trees into skeletons. The next morning, I drove straight to the HOA office. It was in a red brick building, nestled in the so-called Fairgrove Hills Town Center. A sanitized collection of shops, dog groomers, yoga studios, and frozen yogurt bars, all wrapped in smiling banners about community. The HOA occupied the second floor. I walked in without an appointment. The receptionist blinked at me like I'd dropped out of the sky. "I need to speak with Karen Roth," I said, "now." Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She's in a board meeting." "Then I'll wait." I took a seat in the lobby, staring at the framed slogans on the walls. Sustainability through structure. Nature and neighborhood in harmony. Together we thrive. If hypocrisy had a face, it was laminated on that wall. 10 minutes later, Karen emerged. Her outfit was crisp cream blouse, pressed gray slacks, hair held in place like lacquered marble. She spotted me instantly. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her tone syrupy, but with an undertone of steel. I wasn't expecting a visit. "I want construction stopped immediately," I said. "Your crew is illegally on my land." She didn't blink. "We've reviewed the development boundaries thoroughly, sir. The planning committee approved Phase 2, which includes the upper ridge. The county is aware. I spoke to the county. They haven't finalized anything." "You're jumping the gun." "The development overlay is under preliminary review," she said, enunciating each word like a litigator. "And as a community trust initiative, we're operating under temporary authorization while zoning adjustments are processed." I stared at her. "There is no temporary authorization to build 100 cabins on private land." She smiled again, tight and condescending. "You're free to file a dispute, but I'd advise caution. You're in violation of several community statutes already. Unregistered outbuildings, improper drainage maintenance, unauthorized fencing on shared boundaries." I stiffened. "None of that applies to me." "We'll see," she said. "Our legal team is reviewing the matter. Meanwhile, construction proceeds." And just like that, she turned and left me standing in the lobby, fury rising like a tide I could barely contain. By the time I got home, cabin number 1 had its frame up. Workers moved fast, guided by laminated blueprints stapled to tree trunks. I tried speaking to them, asking them who they were hired by, if they knew this was private property. Most just shrugged. One guy told me, "We're paid. That's all we care about." On the second day, I set up trail cams along my boundary lines. Hidden in tree hollows, buried under mulch, strapped behind bark with camo tape. I documented every delivery truck, every excavation. I photographed license plates. I watched my trees fall. Meanwhile, Karen began rolling out her propaganda. Flyers showed up in neighbors' mailboxes, calling the project the Fairgrove Hills Nature Retreat. There were artist renderings of smiling families walking beneath trees with mugs of maple syrup, kids pointing at squirrels, kayakers paddling a pond that didn't even exist. They claimed it would boost property values, honor the natural landscape, and provide eco-learning opportunities for local schools. They didn't mention me. They didn't mention the land was never for sale. And they sure didn't mention the cabins were being built without permits. Worse, the HOA began turning the neighborhood against me. I heard it first from old Tom Delaney, a neighbor who once split firewood with my dad. "They're saying you're holding back progress," he muttered, half ashamed, standing at the edge of my trail. "That you won't share the land. That you're hoarding space that could help the community." "I've never stopped anyone from walking these woods," I said. "But building resorts, paving trails, bulldozing wetlands. Tom nodded slowly. I know. I told Karen that. But she says if you won't cooperate, the board may have to exercise enforcement options. The next day, I got a letter from the HOA's compliance division. It was 3 pages long, citing obscure neighborhood bylaws I'd never agreed to. Apparently, I had encroaching vegetation, unregistered storage structures, and insufficient landscaping cohesion. They demanded corrective action within 30 days, or fines would accrue at $150 per day. The kicker, I wasn't even officially part of the HOA. I'd never signed the community charter. My land wasn't within the original subdivision. But Karen had redrawn maps, extended jurisdiction lines, and submitted paperwork that bundled my parcel into what she called the East Preserve District. No one had voted on it. No one had warned me. She just did it. I reached out to a local attorney, but he sighed when I gave him the story. You're going up against a well-funded HOA with legal precedent in this county. It'll cost you tens of thousands. You sure you want that? I wasn't rich. I had no pension, just savings and a modest retirement check. I couldn't fight them in court. Not yet. But I didn't need to, at least not in their courts. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a weathered folder. Inside were contacts from my forestry days, old names I hadn't called in years. One in particular stood out. Maya Alvarado, former investigator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, now with the BLM's Environmental Crimes Division. We'd once worked together on an illegal logging case in the Cascades. She owed me a favor. Or maybe she didn't. But it was worth a call. I left a message. Maya, it's Paul Whitaker. I've got a situation involving unauthorized development, wetlands destruction, and possible environmental fraud in a maple ecosystem. I need a pair of federal eyes. 3 days later, she called back. Tell me everything, she said. I didn't walk into Karen's next board meeting unprepared. By then, I'd spoken twice with Maya. She'd been shocked not just by the scope of construction, but by the fast pace and how coordinated the paperwork fraud seemed. Cabins in a forested wetland. You realize how many federal statutes that might violate, she said. This isn't just zoning abuse, Paul. This could be criminal. That gave me just enough fuel to do what I'd been dreading, return to that plastic-smelling boardroom on the second floor of Fairgrove Hills Town Center, where smugness oozed from every printed sign and every HOA coffee mug. I walked in during their public meeting portion, notepad in hand, dressed like I was going to war because I was. Khaki work pants, boots caked with mud from my land, my father's old forestry jacket, a stack of printed deed surveys, and a photo of the 1946 boundary marker he'd carved with his initials. Karen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by 6 HOA board members in pastel cardigans and golf shirts, sipping LaCroix and pretending they weren't out for blood. She raised her eyebrows when she saw me. Oh, she said loud enough for the entire room. Mr. Whitaker, nice of you to attend. We were just discussing the progress on the nature retreat cabins. I believe we've already broken ground on Unit 23. I didn't sit. I'm here to state for the record that the land you're building on is privately owned and not part of the HOA jurisdiction. I've brought the original deed historic survey records and GIS overlays. You're trespassing. You are liable. And if you don't stop, federal agents will. Someone in the room snorted. Karen didn't. She folded her hands like a patient teacher waiting on a slow student. Mr. Whitaker, she said sweetly, the board has reviewed the jurisdictional map. Your land falls within the East Preserve expansion zone. We sent notices, certified mail, I believe, and gave you 30 days to respond. You've sent me fraudulent notices, I said, unsigned by the county, not backed by any lawful annexation. She waved a hand as if brushing away a gnat. Let's not get dramatic. We followed proper process. And if you feel otherwise, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I already have, I said, with the Bureau of Land Management, with the EPA, and with the Department of Justice's Environmental Crimes Division. That got her attention. One of the board members, a bald man with a Bluetooth earpiece and deep tan lines from golf, leaned forward. Are you threatening legal action? I turned to him. No, I'm confirming it's already begun. Karen finally dropped the smile. For a heartbeat, the room was dead quiet. Then she chuckled a short, sharp, unbelieving laugh that cut through the air like a saw blade. Mr. Whitaker, do you honestly think some dusty federal agency is going to come racing down here over a few trees and drainage ditches? We're talking about community revitalization, jobs, education, tourism. Do you know how many people support this? I stared back. Do you know how many endangered species live in those woods? How many laws you've already broken by paving over wetlands without proper impact studies? She rolled her eyes. It's a seasonal creek. No. It's a designated riparian buffer zone under state law. I've already filed the GIS coordinates with the agency, and I've submitted drone footage from your own contractors as evidence. Her mouth twitched. Listen, she said, leaning forward like we were old friends. Why don't we talk just the two of us? No lawyers, no boards, no threats. I think we can find a solution that doesn't involve chaos. There's only one solution, I said. Get off my land. She exhaled slowly, then sat back, eyes narrowing. You know, Mr. Whitaker, your tone borders on hostility. Maybe we should revisit the compliance violations we discussed. Your fencing, your old shed, that unpermitted solar panel. You're not above the rules. I never claimed to be, I said. But you're not above federal law either, and it's coming for you. I left the meeting before they could adjourn, leaving my documentation copies on the table. As I walked out, I saw Karen grab them and toss them into the recycling bin near the door. She didn't even read them. That night, I found another letter taped to my gate. Notice of non-compliance, unauthorized tree removal. According to the letter, I'd illegally harvested multiple hardwood trees without HOA approval, which was absurd. I hadn't felled a single tree since winter, and those had been storm damaged. But this wasn't about rules. This was retaliation. I called Maya. Her voice was calm but purposeful. Paul, I've looped in our field liaison for your region. We're reviewing your footage and environmental maps now. From what I've seen, this could trigger not only EPA violations, but also criminal charges if they knowingly falsified jurisdiction boundaries. They did. I've got signatures from the original surveyor who says his work was altered. Good, she said. We'll be in touch soon. Just hold your ground. Don't escalate. I hung up and stared out the window toward the forest. The cabins had crept farther, now visible even from the porch. Their lights flickered through the trees like invaders. The hum of generators, the pounding of hammers, it all felt like a war I was losing. Then something even worse happened. The town newspaper printed an op-ed titled, "A Stubborn Old Man Against Progress." It accused me of hoarding forest land blocking jobs and standing in the way of a bold new vision for ecotourism. The byline, Karen Roth. She called me out by name. And the next day, someone vandalized my mailbox, spray-painted in red. Tree hog. I didn't say anything to the sheriff. I didn't have to. They were already in Karen's pocket. But I wasn't alone anymore. Maya's team emailed me a week later with an official notice a federal site inspection had been authorized. They would arrive unannounced. They advised me to remain calm, keep records, and stay out of the way. I had waited months for something to change. Now it was finally coming. Karen could laugh all she wanted. She wouldn't be laughing much longer. It's strange how quickly destruction can disguise itself as progress. By the time the federal site inspection was officially scheduled, the forest I once knew had already been carved into a grid. Trails that I had walked for decades, silent winding paths lined with moss and maple leaves, were now flattened into muddy service roads. The sugar maples, the very trees that gave my family its livelihood for generations, had been clear-cut in geometric swaths. In their place rose pale wooden boxes, angular prefab cabins stacked like Monopoly houses, with vinyl siding and fake shutters. They didn't belong here. They never would. I counted 32 completed structures by the end of that week. They stood in rows facing each other like they were mocking the wildness they'd replaced. And still they built more. Cabin numbers were spray-painted in neon orange on plywood boards 33, 34, 35. The crews moved with a brutal efficiency, pouring concrete footers into the loam, leveling the slope that once held a fox den, drilling septic lines into places where the groundwater barely trickled beneath fern beds. Their equipment clanged through the forest at all hours. Bulldozers, augers, nail guns, even a mobile cement mixer that roared past my gate like a tank. I tried staying indoors, but even with the window shut, I could feel it. The vibrations, the noise, the foreignness. It was like someone had taken a knife to the skin of the earth and left it bleeding daylight and diesel. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The animals had started vanishing. The barred owls that used to call across the ravine silent. The deer that wandered through the sugar groves, gone. Even the squirrels had retreated except for one stubborn pair nesting in the eaves of my woodshed, chittering every morning like they too were outraged. Karen, of course, had doubled down. Her latest flyer, delivered door to door by smiling high schoolers, boasted 75 cabins by month's end. In bold green font, she'd partnered with some ecotourism startup called Rooted Experiences, promising curated nature retreats, yoga in the pines, sustainable maple syrup tastings, using locally sourced syrup, of course, though they'd have to find it somewhere else. The flyer had my land outlined in green, labeled as the Whitaker Reserve. I never gave them that name. One morning, I walked to the ridge above the largest clearing. Cabin number 49 was halfway framed, and the crew was blasting music from a portable speaker, some generic pop anthem that echoed off the hills like laughter at a funeral. I stood just beyond the tree line unnoticed until a backhoe pivoted and dumped a load of gravel onto what used to be my grandmother's favorite mushroom patch. My hands shook. I gripped the bark of a nearby maple so tightly the lichen broke off in flakes. That was when I saw Karen again. She arrived in a spotless SUV parked under the only tree they hadn't cut yet and stepped out with two men in suits. She was dressed for the cameras, tan trench coat, high-heeled boots, sunglasses perched on her head. She pointed at different parts of the site while the men nodded and took notes. A photographer followed, snapping pictures like they were scouting a real estate brochure. I knew what she was doing, getting ahead of the feds, framing the project as a success, a marvel of modern, sustainable development, a model for other HOAs nationwide. I'd heard her on the local podcast the night before saying phrases like community-driven conservation, public-private harmony, and leveraging underutilized green zones for ecological appreciation. Underutilized green zones. That's what she called my home. The photographer finally spotted me. He froze, lowered the camera. Karen turned and followed his gaze. Her smile returned. She raised a hand and waved, mocking, calm, as if this was all just a minor disagreement between neighbors. I turned and walked back home before I did something I'd regret. Later that day, I found two more compliance notices in my mailbox. One claimed that I had unauthorized refuse piles, referring to the neat stack of firewood I'd kept since February. Another cited visual disharmony with neighborhood aesthetic, which as best I could tell meant my cabin looked too old for her liking. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't come with threats of $200 per day fines. But I didn't fight her with anger, not yet. Instead, I waited. I recorded everything. Timestamps, truck deliveries, water diversions, images of soil, runoff clouding the creek behind cabin number 38. I documented the flattening of the wetland near the south bend, the plastic pipes sticking out of the ground like straws in poisoned earth. Maya instructed me to install more cameras, so I did. Hidden in bird boxes, nestled in split logs, even strapped under the porch railings of unfinished cabins when crews weren't looking. They captured everything, work being done without sediment, fencing fuel stored too close to waterways, construction crews urinating in open areas where groundwater pooled. All violations, all on tape. The day before the federal inspection, I sat on my porch with Rufus lying at my feet, watching the sunlight pour over the cabins, like a lie being dressed in gold. The forest no longer sounded like home. It sounded like suburbia, alive with engines and distant conversation, the scent of sawdust and chemical sealant thick in the air. I heard children laughing somewhere near cabin number 19. A family had arrived early for a preview stay. They wandered the site like tourists in a museum of destruction, snapping selfies next to logs that had once been trees older than my father. One of the kids tripped on an exposed root, and I watched the mother glare toward my property as if I were responsible. The next morning, I found a bag of trash tossed over my fence, yogurt cups, protein bar wrappers, a sock. The boundary between their fake world and mine was disappearing. But I had something they didn't: time-stamped evidence, real maps, federal law, and a memory of what this land used to be, how it sounded when the wind moved through the untouched canopy, how the sap ran sweet in March, how my daughter once fell asleep in my arms beneath the very tree where they now parked construction trailers. They'd built a wall of cabins and concrete around me, but they didn't know that I'd already started building something else, something invisible, legal, inevitable. And it was coming. They didn't need to burn my house down to erase me. All they had to do was isolate me, cut off my voice, my presence, my humanity, until I was just the whisper in the trees, the grumbling old man who refused to move forward. The first time I heard it was at the farmer's market. I'd gone into town for syrup jars and fencing staples my first time in over a week, and noticed the way conversations quieted as I walked past. At the honey stall, two women I used to chat with every spring turned their backs. I overheard one whisper, "That's the recluse from the forest, the one who hates kids." I hadn't said a word about children. I hadn't even spoken publicly. But the story had spread fast, well-funded, and carefully crafted. Karen's latest HOA bulletin featured a glowing editorial from a supposed local nature educator praising the cabins as an extraordinary leap forward for environmental literacy and criticizing certain individuals clinging to outdated land monopolies at the expense of communal enrichment. There was a cartoon illustration me supposedly standing with arms crossed in front of a no trespassing sign while smiling families tried to pass. I looked like a cave troll. It was a PR masterpiece. Back in the neighborhood, HOA volunteers went door to door with welcome baskets for new eco-retreat members. They handed out branded reusable water bottles, trail maps of my forest, and discount codes for upcoming cabin stays. One even knocked on my door. I didn't answer. I just watched from behind the curtain as they slid a flyer into my mailbox and walked off smiling. The flyer had a bold title: "Reclaiming the Wild Why, One Man's Forest Can't Block a Community's Future." That night, someone dumped a wheelbarrow full of pine bark mulch across my driveway entrance. Rufus barked so loud I thought his throat would tear. No one confessed. No one cared. The sheriff didn't come. He never did. The next week, I was removed from the neighborhood newsletter email list. At the town library, my library card had HOA non-compliant flagged in the system. I asked the librarian who'd known me for 15 years what that meant. She gave me a look of vague discomfort and said, "Maybe check with your HOA rep." My HOA rep. I didn't have one. I never agreed to any of this. But it didn't matter. In their eyes, I was now part of the HOA, whether I liked it or not. Worse, some of the neighbors I once considered kind, even friends, began to turn cold. Tom Delaney, who once helped me dig trenches after a storm, avoided eye contact at the post office. When I called out to him, he simply nodded and shuffled away. His wife Beth crossed the street to avoid walking past my truck. They were scared not of me, but of being associated with me. Karen had made an example of me. This is what happens when you resist, when you challenge the vision, when you try to stand in the way of a force wrapped in words like community, nature, and progress. And yet, deep inside, I still knew who I was. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't dangerous. I was a man who'd kept a promise to my father, to my daughter, and to the trees that had sheltered us all. But that didn't stop the whispers. At the diner, I overheard someone mutter, "He talks to trees, you know. Lives up there with cameras and traps. Probably writes manifestos." At church, someone had anonymously added my name to the prayer list under troubled individuals. Even the kids who used to wave when they biked past my lane stopped looking my way. Karen didn't need to win in court. She was winning with perception. And for a time it worked. I withdrew. I stopped going into town. I let my beard grow out, stopped checking the mail. I spent most of my time in the woods documenting every move, every pipe, every trench. I tracked the septic tanks they were burying too close to the creek. I filmed their chemical storage units. I photographed the erosion lines where they failed to stabilize slopes, letting sediment bleed into protected waterways. But no one saw the data. They only saw me, the angry, lonely man hiding behind trees. Until one afternoon, a car pulled up my gravel path. Not a construction truck, not an HOA courier. A federal vehicle. Two agents stepped out, badges from the BLM and the EPA. They greeted me by name. "Mr. Whitaker, we've reviewed the materials you submitted. We'd like your help walking the perimeter. We believe this site may qualify for emergency enforcement under multiple violations." I blinked at them. I thought you'd come next week. The taller agent, a woman with a calm, steady voice, smiled. "There's enough concern that we move the timeline forward. We're here to gather evidence for a potential injunction." Behind them, a third vehicle arrived, marked with the seal of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That's when I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. I wasn't just the crazy hermit in the woods. I was a witness, a landowner. And soon, I would become something more, a force they couldn't ignore. The morning the federal agents arrived to inspect my land, the air felt different, charged like the forest was holding its breath. It had rained the night before, just enough to leave the underbrush damp and the soil soft underfoot. Mist clung low to the ridge, winding through the trees like a ghost, unsure of where it belonged now. I met them by the creek. 3 vehicles, 5 agents. Not one of them looked like they came for a casual walk in the woods. They wore weatherproof gear, carried GPS devices, soil testing kits, thermal drones, and clipboards thick with maps and regulations. And they listened. Maya wasn't among them. She was coordinating remotely, but I could feel her hand in every question they asked. We started with the southern ridge. This is where the first cabins went up, I explained, pointing to a cluster of boxy structures. No erosion control, no water retention plan. They ripped out 10 sugar maples and compacted the soil so tight it won't breathe for years. Agent Lou from the EPA crouched near the creek bank and scooped a small vial of water. "See the cloudiness," he said to his colleague. "Sediment runoff. That's a Clean Water Act violation if it's coming from upstream construction." Another Agent Sullivan from the BLM unfurled a laminated satellite map and compared it to a drone still hovering above the treetops. They graded part of the hillside. "That's a slope over 20%. State law requires special permits. I'll bet they didn't pull any." "They didn't," I said. We moved north, past the cabins now advertised online as glamping getaways. I pointed out the black plastic tubing meant for gray water management, installed without trenching depth compliance. We found one cabin's pipes dripping directly into a shallow wildlife pond I'd preserved since my father's time. "That's a felony," Agent Lou muttered, "and they marketed this as ecotourism." I handed him the brochure. He read the first few lines and snorted. These people wouldn't know a watershed if it flooded their kitchen. Then we reached the ravine. This was sacred ground. Not in any religious sense, but in the way time imprints itself on the land like scars, like memories. My father used to take me down there to look for deer tracks in the spring thaw. Emily had carved her initials into one of the low boulders when she was 12. A soft trickle of water always ran through it even in August when the forest dried out. But now it was filled with concrete. They'd poured a slab across the ravine to use as a staging platform. Piles of gravel sat where fiddlehead ferns used to unfurl in the spring. Their trucks had left grooves so deep they formed standing pools, breeding mosquitoes and rot. And worse, just behind the slab was a stack of discarded containers, pesticides, solvents, half-full paint cans, all under a ripped tarp. Agent Sullivan turned pale. They stored chemicals within 30 feet of a riparian channel. That's 3 different violations. 4 if the containers leaked, and judging by that smell, he trailed off and began snapping photos. By the time we reached the Northern Trail, the place I used to tap first for syrup every February, one of the agents had stopped taking notes. He just walked in silence, stunned. Then we found the wetland, or rather what used to be one. It was now a parking lot, gravel, graded, bordered by railroad ties and striped with yellow paint. Several SUVs were parked there, including one labeled HOA Security. I'd avoided this area since the construction intensified, but now I stood frozen, throat tightening. "This was protected," I said. "You can see the sedges along the edges. The red-winged blackbirds used to nest here." Lou kneeled and ran his fingers over the cracked soil. They bulldozed a seasonal wetland without permits. If this was under jurisdiction, which it likely was, they're not just in violation of environmental codes. This could be prosecuted under the Wetlands Protection Act. Then his eyes narrowed. "There's a federal grant tied to this parcel. See that post?" He pointed to a rusted metal sign barely poking through a pile of discarded shingles. I brushed away the debris. Underneath the metal plate read, "Federal Wetlands Conservation Grant Area, protected under Title 33 U.S. Code 41344. I stared at it for a long time. That grant had been awarded in 1992, back when my father managed the land as part of a state partnership. He'd worked for years to get it designated. That's why he never let developers near it. That's why it was passed to me with such care. They hadn't just bulldozed a swamp. They'd bulldozed a federally funded conservation site. The agents called in reinforcements. By mid-afternoon, 2 additional vehicles had arrived, and a field office had been temporarily set up at the edge of the clearing. Drones flew higher. Samples were sealed and tagged. One of the Army Corps officers began measuring slope angles and photographing sediment overflow. I stayed quiet through most of it. I didn't need to speak. The forest was telling the story now through every scar, every stump, every unnatural pool of water and poisoned root system. At one point, I noticed Agent Lou looking at the cabins through a pair of binoculars. He lowered them and said to no one in particular, "How did they think they'd get away with this?" I answered softly, "Because they always do, until someone doesn't let them." That night, I sat on the porch with Rufus beside me and watched as the agents packed up their samples, sealed their gear, and drove away into the falling dusk. No arrests, not yet. But something had shifted. The silence was different now, no longer suffocating, but expectant. They had come. They had seen. And now, they would act. My phone buzzed just after 9 p.m. It was Maya. "We've confirmed at least 7 violations," she said. "More coming. We're preparing an enforcement order." "You did well, Paul. You gave the forest a voice." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said the only thing that mattered. "When do they have to stop?" "Soon," she said, "very soon." It happened on a Thursday morning just before sunrise, when the mist still clung low over the forest floor and the dew made everything shimmer like glass. I was drinking coffee on the porch, Rufus lying at my feet, his ears twitching at every bird call or distant crack of a twig. The forest for a moment felt like it used to. Still. Breathing. Then I heard the tires. Not one car, several, heavy. Within minutes, the gravel road trembled as a line of black and white SUVs, marked with federal agency seals, wound up the path like a convoy. Behind them came a box truck with portable barricades, followed by a smaller vehicle carrying personnel in U.S. Fish and Wildlife vests. Another 2 cars bore the green and white markings of the Army Corps of Engineers. No announcement, no warning, just boots on the ground. I set my coffee down slowly. They weren't here to take notes anymore. They were here to shut it down. Rufus barked and bounded toward the front gate, tail stiff. I grabbed his collar and held him beside me as the first agent, Agent Lou, stepped out of his vehicle and approached with a calm, steady gait. "Morning, Mr. Whitaker," he said, tucking his clipboard under one arm. "I told you it would be soon." Behind him, more agents emerged. Some carried enforcement kits. Others had body cameras already rolling. A tall woman in EPA greens unfurled a laminated order and handed it to me without ceremony. "Emergency cease and desist order. Federal Environmental Compliance Enforcement. Effective immediately." At the bottom was the signature of a federal magistrate. I stared at the paper. "They're not gonna believe it," I muttered. "Oh," Lou said with the faintest smile. "They will." They moved quickly. Within 15 minutes, they'd cordoned off the entrance to the development zone. Metal barricades unfolded. No entry. Federal investigation signs were posted. Surveyors set up tripods and digital levels, while environmental techs unspooled cords to monitor groundwater runoff and air quality. The crews were efficient, professional, uncompromising. I followed behind them at a distance, barely breathing. When we reached the clearing, the heart of the project site, Karen was already there. She stood in front of cabin number 41 in a tailored gray coat and low heels, her lips pursed, arms crossed. 2 board members flanked her, visibly rattled. One clutched a binder. The other was on a cell phone, pacing in circles like he could call this storm away. Karen didn't blink. Agent Sullivan approached her directly and handed her a second document. "This is a federal enforcement notice. Your development has been ordered to cease all operations. Your project has violated no fewer than 8 environmental statutes. You are to vacate the premises immediately." Karen took the paper but didn't look at it. "There must be some mistake," she said, voice steely. "This land is under HOA jurisdiction. We've had approval for months." Sullivan didn't budge. "Your permits were based on falsified documents. You never had legal authority to build here." She glanced past him, saw me standing behind the line of agents. Our eyes locked. Her expression didn't flinch, but I saw the fear bloom beneath it. The kind of fear that only shows when someone realizes the empire they built wasn't a castle, it was a house of cards. "I demand to speak to a county representative," she said. "We followed every process. This is political." A second agent stepped forward. "This isn't political," she said flatly. "This is federal law." The crew behind her began to fidget. One man in a hard hat asked, "Wait, are we getting shut down, like completely?" Agent Lou turned to him. "You're trespassing on protected land. This site is under investigation. You are not to touch a single tool." The worker's face paled. Within an hour, chaos unraveled. Crews began backing out trailers. Equipment was turned off mid-operation. Power generators were unplugged. One contractor tried to argue that his team was only there for landscaping until an agent showed him a map of the illegally diverted creek system they'd helped carve. A drone flew overhead, circling the cabins, recording every structure. Karen tried to gather her board, but one of them, Dan Hensley, the HOA treasurer, stepped back and muttered something I couldn't hear. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods like a man abandoning a ship he suddenly realized was sinking. By mid-morning, local media had arrived. They weren't tipped off by me, but someone had leaked the enforcement notice. A news van parked just outside the barricade. A woman in a bright pink blazer stood in front of a camera, the HOA sign behind her, where today federal agents have issued a full-stop work order on what was hailed as Fairgrove's most ambitious ecotourism project. Karen walked past the camera without speaking. She climbed into her SUV, slammed the door, and peeled out down the dirt road, spinning rocks into the mist behind her. That was the last time I saw her on my land. That afternoon, the agents let me walk the forest with them one last time. We documented the destruction, every scar, every violation. They took down notes, photos, audio logs. One of them shook his head as we passed what used to be the old sugar trail. "It's not just illegal," he said, "it's disgraceful." But I didn't respond. I was too busy listening. Because for the first time in weeks, I could hear the forest again. Not the engines, not the construction noise, but the sounds that had always been there. The rustle of leaves in a breeze, the far-off call of a crow, the hush of creek water returning to its bed. Rufus trotted ahead of us, sniffing the base of a stump. He looked back once, tail wagging, as if to say, "See, it's coming back." And it was. That night, I slept soundly, for the first time in months. I didn't check the mailbox. I didn't scan for trail cameras, or compliance notices, or new violations posted on my gate. Because the people who had come today, they didn't carry threats. They carried truth. And now the weight of that truth rested on Karen's shoulders. Let her try to laugh now. They started with cabin number 1. It stood closest to the old trailhead, just 20 yards from where the maples once arched overhead like a cathedral. Now, with federal crews spread across the clearing, that first cabin stood exposed, silent and temporary, like a lie that had lingered too long in the light. I stood beside Agent Liu as the backhoe roared to life. Its engine rumbled low, then climbed to a mechanical growl that echoed across the hills. The operator gave one last glance at the surveyor's flag, then drove the machine forward, shovel arm rising like a question mark. Then came the first strike. The bucket crushed through the roof in one solid punch, splintering plywood and insulation in a burst of dust and foam. It cracked open like a rotten shell beams, collapsing inward windows, shattering the plastic welcome mat, flapping upward like it wanted to escape. I flinched, but didn't look away. They moved quickly after that. Cabins number 2 through 5 were leveled by noon, one after another, in a rhythm of destruction. The crews worked with a methodical fury, calculated, precise, yet tinged with something close to indignation. You could tell these weren't just workers, they were environmental responders. They'd seen this before, they hated it, and they were here to make it right. By day 220, cabins were gone. Just gone. Where vinyl siding had once glared white against the tree line, there was now only churned soil piles of debris, and a growing sense that the forest was inhaling again. Not healed, but breathing. I watched most of it from the ridge. Rufus stayed near, curling at my feet, while the wind carried faint traces of pine diesel and broken drywall. It should have been satisfying, vindicating. But the truth was, it hurt. Because every blow of the shovel wasn't just justice, it was a reminder of what had been lost. You can remove the cabins, but you can't uncut a tree. You can pull up pipes, but you can't bring back the root systems they severed. And the animals, they didn't come back right away. The silence between the birdsong felt heavier now, like it still didn't trust the noise had truly stopped. On the third day, I walked the edge of the wetland with Agent Sullivan. After we removed the gravel, he said, pointing toward the makeshift parking lot, "We'll reseed native grasses. You'll see regrowth by spring if the soil tests hold." I nodded. "What happens to them?" I asked quietly. "Karen, the board." He hesitated. "The EPA is coordinating with DOJ on a joint investigation," he said. "There's enough evidence to charge them with multiple violations. Fraud, wetland destruction, falsified permits, conspiracy to misrepresent zoning authority." He glanced at me. There's a good chance she'll face prosecution, maybe even jail time. But that'll take months. I stared at the flattened earth. It already feels like a lifetime. He said nothing. On day 4, the news crews returned. This time they wanted me on camera. I declined at first, but then I saw the headline being filmed behind the reporter's shoulder. Illegal HOA development faces federal demolition. And realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a warning. So I stepped into the frame. I didn't speak dramatically, no grand speeches, just a few quiet truths. That forest belonged to my father and his father before him. It's not just land, it's alive. And what happened here wasn't a misunderstanding. It was theft with paperwork. When the interview aired, I didn't watch it. But Emily did. She called me that night in tears. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she said. "You protected something real." I almost couldn't speak. Because for months, I'd felt like a ghost, haunted by sawdust and laughter that didn't belong, turned into a villain by people with slogans and funding. But now my name was no longer smeared across HOA newsletters. It was tied to restoration. On day 6, they reached the cabins deeper in the grove, numbers in the 60s and 70s. These had been partially furnished. Someone had even left candles in the windows, fake ivy wrapped around porch rails. They looked almost lived in. I didn't ask where Karen was. No one knew. Rumor had it she'd hired lawyers, that the HOA board had resigned en masse, that the developer who partnered with her had already filed for bankruptcy. It didn't matter. The forest didn't care about their lawsuits. It only cared that the noise was gone. By the end of the week, there was a moment, a single moment, where I stood at the edge of the clearing and realized the sky looked different, brighter. Not because of the absence of cabins, but because of the return of depth. You could see through the trees again. Light filtered the way it used to, painting the moss gold where it touched. I reached down and brushed my hand along a low mound of earth soft with fallen needles. It would take years, maybe longer. But I could rebuild. Not with concrete, not with lumber. With patience, with seeds. With the simple act of letting go and letting the land breathe again. As the last cabin fell, a hush settled over the grove. The crews shut off their machines. The engines sputtered into silence. And all you could hear was the wind threading through branches, stirring the ghosts of 100 wrongs now being set right. One of the workers removed his hard hat, looked at me, and said, "Never seen a takedown like this. You really brought the hammer." I shook my head. "I didn't bring the hammer," I said. "I just held the line." And as I turned back toward my cabin, Rufus trotting behind me tail high, I felt the forest at my back, not as a place I owned, but as a friend that had been wounded and was finally starting to heal. One cabin at a time. It didn't take long for the cracks in Karen's kingdom to widen into chasms. By the time the final cabin was reduced to splinters and hauled away in dumpsters marked "Federal Evidence," the press had already caught wind of the deeper story. Not just an illegal development, but a carefully orchestrated fraud stretching across HOA lines, development firms, and zoning offices. The headlines came fast and sharp. HOA president under federal investigation for land seizure scheme. EPA uncovers major violations in maple forest development. Developers' eco-retreat was built on stolen land. Karen's photo appeared everywhere. That same polished smile from the HOA newsletter now haunted every news banner, plastered beside words like indictment, false documentation, and wetland destruction. The woman who once ruled Fairgrove like a queen was now the subject of an FBI-led task force investigating land fraud in 3 neighboring counties. They froze her personal assets first. Then came the subpoenas. It turned out she wasn't just expanding the HOA's influence, she'd been profiting off it too. Every cabin constructed under the so-called Nature Retreat project had been backed by off-the-book investors. She'd accepted silent funding from a private holding company registered under her cousin's name. The plan was to flip the eco-cabins for short-term vacation rentals marketed toward city dwellers looking for a forest escape. What they didn't count on was that forest fighting back. By mid-month, a grand jury had been convened. Karen was indicted on multiple federal counts: falsification of public documents, destruction of protected wetlands, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy to defraud the federal government. I watched her arraignment on the courthouse steps from my porch, coffee in hand, Rufus curled against my boots. She wore black, oversized sunglasses, lips pressed into a flat line, surrounded by attorneys who looked like they hadn't slept in days. She said nothing to the reporters, just pushed past them head down like she could outwalk the truth. But there was no more outpacing what she'd done, and she wasn't the only one falling. The entire HOA board resigned within 2 weeks, every single one. Some claimed ignorance. Some offered quiet apologies. Others vanished. Their emails bounced. Their names disappeared from the HOA directory. But the damage was already done. Neighbors who had once looked at me with suspicion now looked at me with shame. At the grocery store, Tom Delaney approached with his cap in his hands, eyes down. "Paul," he said barely above a whisper, "I should have stood with you. I knew something was off. I didn't want to believe it." I nodded. "I understand." Beth left a pie on my porch. It had a note taped to the lid. For the man who told the truth before the rest of us were ready to hear it. Even the sheriff paid me a visit, unexpected, awkward. "Just wanted to say," he muttered, rocking on his heels, "if you ever need anything, we owe you. The whole damn town does." I didn't say much in return. Forgiveness, I've learned, is a quiet thing. You don't have to declare it, you just live it. Still, not everything could be repaired. Karen's development had scared off the animals, killed dozens of trees, altered the creek's natural course. The scars wouldn't heal overnight, but at least the bleeding had stopped. I started getting letters from people outside of Fairgrove, landowners, activists, former Forest Service rangers, people who'd seen what happened and wanted to help. One woman wrote from Vermont. "They tried the same thing here. We didn't win. You give me hope." I never thought I'd be that for anyone. Hope. But somehow I had become something larger than just the guy with a cabin in the woods. I had become a symbol. The town even asked me to speak at a community gathering they organized not at a town hall, but under the maple trees that had survived. They called it Restoration Day. I declined at first. Public speaking was never my thing. I preferred the quiet of the trees, the simple rhythm of boiling sap, cutting firewood, walking trails with Rufus. But then I thought of Emily. I thought of my father. And I thought of what it meant to speak for something that can't speak for itself. So I went. I stood on a wooden platform built from reclaimed lumber, some of it salvaged from the cabins that had once trespassed here, and I looked out at the crowd. People I had once feared, faces that had once turned away. Now they leaned forward, and I said, "I didn't do this for attention. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it because this land raised me. It taught me patience, humility, and respect. And when someone tried to silence it, I listened. That's all I did. I listened." The applause was gentle, and it was enough. That night, back at home, I found a single sapling had sprouted near the base of a stump the cabins had once covered. A young maple, fragile, new, defiant. I crouched beside it, brushed the soil around its base, and whispered, "You're safe now." And I meant it. The forest and I healed in parallel. At first, it was slow, barely noticeable. The way grief fades not by vanishing, but by softening its grip. After the last of the federal crews cleared out and the cameras stopped coming, I was left with the quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like an invitation. I spent the early mornings walking the trails with Rufus, checking the flagged saplings planted by conservation volunteers. The young trees, red maples, white ash, sweet birch, stood staked and fragile, each one a promise of what might return if given time. Some days, I sat for hours at the edge of the old creek, now freed from its diverted path. I watched dragonflies skim the surface, frogs return to the pond that had been drained and crushed under gravel. Slowly, the chorus of the forest began to build again, tentative birdsong, the whisper of leaves regrowing, even the scurry of squirrels reclaiming the branches. I never imagined joy could be so quiet. And me, I stopped being just the man who had lost something. I became the man who'd fought to protect it. Emily visited that spring the first time in over 2 years. She arrived with her son, my grandson Leo, in a borrowed Subaru, and stepped out with wide eyes and a grin that melted a year of weight off my chest. "It looks alive," she said, turning in a slow circle beneath the newly budded canopy. I nodded. "It is, again." Leo was 5. He asked questions about everything. Why the trees had numbers painted on them. Why some stumps looked burned. Why the little tree had a name tag around it. "That one's yours," I told him, pointing at a sapling near the path. "Mine," he said, mouth open. "You helped plant it. That means it's part of your story now." He smiled like I'd given him the moon. That night, we built a fire in the old ring out back and roasted marshmallows. while Leo fell asleep curled in a sleeping bag on the porch. Emily and I sat side by side watching the embers glow and listening to the creak of the tire swing still hanging from the sugar maple. "I watched all the hearings," she said softly. "You were incredible, Dad." I shrugged. "I just kept showing up, that's all." "No," she said, turning to me. "You stood your ground. You never let them take you with it." I didn't have words for that, so I just reached for her hand and held it like I hadn't since she was little and afraid of thunder. Eventually, the lawsuits wrapped up. Karen accepted a plea deal that spared her prison, but not her reputation. She was banned from holding any leadership position in any HOA or land development entity for life. She lost her home, her seat on the board, and the legacy she thought she'd built. As for the HOA itself, it was restructured from the ground up. A new board was elected this time, with bylaws that included environmental oversight and homeowner voting rights. They reached out to me to consult on boundary policies and restoration grants. At first I declined, but eventually I agreed on one condition. No one ever builds beyond the creek again. They signed it into their charter. My land was formally exempted, protected under both federal and local ordinances, recognized as a conservation easement named the Whitaker Grove. I didn't want the name, but someone at the EPA insisted. "You earned it," she said, so I let it stay. Rufus got older too. His muzzle grayed his runs, turned to walks, but he never stopped patrolling the perimeter like the guardian he'd always been. When he passed, I buried him beneath the biggest maple, the one that had shaded 3 generations of our family, and I carved his name gently into the bark. It was the first time I cried in months, but it wasn't the same grief as before. It was clean, cathartic. That fall, I tapped sap from a new stand of trees. The syrup was thin, but honest. I bottled it with simple white labels and gave it to neighbors, some who had once believed I was a madman, now offering to help repair fences and plant trees. One of them, Beth, invited me to speak at the middle school Earth Day program. I said no at first, but later that night I found myself scribbling thoughts on an old envelope, words about trees and roots, about how land holds memory, about how sometimes the hardest thing to do is believe you're right when everyone says you're not. And I said yes. The kids listened. Some asked good questions. One girl asked if I ever got lonely out there in the woods. I told her not anymore. And it was true, because I wasn't just the man in the cabin. I was the steward of something sacred, something worth fighting for. Not for profit, not for attention, but because it mattered. Because sometimes justice doesn't look like a courtroom verdict. It looks like the first green bud on a tree that almost didn't survive. It sounds like a bird returning to a branch that had been silenced. It feels like peace in your chest where anger used to live. I still walk the forest every morning, still touch the bark, still listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear my father's voice in the wind, telling me he's proud, telling me I did what he taught me to do. Hold the line, speak for what can't speak, and never ever stop protecting home.